Hi, I'm Don Clemmer, editor of Connection Magazine with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. And I'm here today with Network Senior Fellow Ralph McCloud to discuss his work and life and the issues that have informed his justice journey. Ralph is soon to receive the Eileen Egan Peacemaker Award from Pax Christi, USA. It's an award that's given only periodically to people and organizations that have made an extraordinary contribution to the world of social justice and peace. The award was last given in 2010 to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. So we at Network are thrilled now to have Ralph as part of our community and to just learn a little bit more about the issues that make him tick. Ralph, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Don. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So just to start with a little bit of your background, where's home? Tell us about your family and just in your background as a Catholic.
Sure. Hi. My home is in Fort Worth, Texas. I was born and raised in Fort Worth. My parents, at a very early age, 5 or 6 years old, sent us to Catholic schools. All 6 of my siblings and myself to Catholic schools, even though we weren't Catholic. They had such a high regard for education, and they knew the Catholic schools had a high success rate. So they sent us there. And we ended up, all of us ended up going the non-traditional route of joining the Catholic Church when we were about in the 7th and 8th grades. And but my parents never did. My parents never converted, even though they held in high regard the teachings of the church and made sure that we were at Mass every Sunday and made sure we had the sacraments and had a great appreciation for the church. And at the time, I think one of the big influences on me were the sisters there, who were incredibly unselfish, who worked 24 hours a day in the school, who would drag us up and down the streets of the community, the low income community where we were, to try to raise funds, to act on behalf of some of the needs of the kids in the school. So it made a profound impact on me at a very early age.
So like that experience basically sowed the seeds that got you into activism and organizing work, or?
Yeah, I would say that was a big part of it. It was kind of a perfect storm of influence, if you will, in that I had the sisters and the influence of the Catholic Church at the time, but I also had some very strong parents and grandparents who were advocates in their own right. I mean, I'd like to say they were some of the very first community organizers who would bring folks together and discuss and learn about issues and act on the issues. My grandmother would drag us to polling places, and I never really understood what a poll was or what polling places were at 6 and 7 years old, and make us sit there the entire day and listen as and watch as people came in to cast their ballots. And so at that time, imprinting the important value of participating in the community by voting. But my parents were like really very active in the community. My father was a soldier and actually fought in 3 different wars. And my mother, because there were 7 of us, we never really left Fort Worth. We were around Fort Worth, but they were active in what happened in the neighborhood. They were active in what happened in the schools, what happened in the church. Even again, as I mentioned, they weren't Catholic themselves.
Wow, I mean that's quite a formation, if you will. So I know you eventually got involved in local government. What was the path into that from these roots?
Well, just like my path to Catholicism, the path in the local government was kind of non-traditional as well. There were several folks, and I lived and worked in a low-income community. I worked in the Diocese of Fort Worth, and I saw some very painful sights, seeing folks who were hungry, who were struggling, who were looking for housing, interacting with a Catholic Charities agency. I had a chance to meet and see and interact with folks who were just struggling for their day-to-day survival. And a election came up for city council members in Fort Worth, Texas, and and we had no way of winning. We just wanted to make sure that the right issues were discussed, and we didn't want to win. We were glad that we did, but we wanted to make sure that the conversation was those that kept the folks that we're talking about at heart. Uh, and so I had a campaign. I ended up winning in Fort Worth at the time. I think it's now one of the 12th or 13th largest cities in the country. Ended up being elected mayor pro tem. But I like to think that I had an impact on those communities that elected me. Again, low income. Somewhere at the time, the average income was between $20,000 and $40,000 per family in the district that I represented. So they folks struggled, and they were folks who had needs for gainful employment, for representation in schools, for the kind of safe, affordable housing, just things that everybody else would want, but just did not have access to it.
Hmm. So this would eventually lead to your rather lengthy tenure as the head of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which for our viewers, the Campaign for Human Development is an anti-poverty program that the Catholic bishops of the United States founded in 1970. And it was envisioned not as direct service to people in poverty, but to fund community organizing efforts and economic development. Really kind of a visionary thing for its time, and overseen through the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is basically an organization that allows bishops across all the dioceses of the United States to collaborate and work together on national issues. Ralph, could you speak to just briefly into your journey into that work, but also how you approach that rather prophetic vision that is of the bishops and with this program?
Sure. I had a bit of a bird's eye view when I was in Fort Worth. I was able to see one of the groups, or the Dallas and Fort Worth groups, who worked in community organizing and economic development, and were funded by the Catholic Campaign for Human Development when I was working in Fort Worth. And I had a chance to see the type of work they did before I accepted and was appointed the job at the USCCB for CCHD. So seeing the type of work that had several components to it. It had a component that was leadership development, where we helped people understand what issues were, helped people, reminded people of the human dignity that they had, because for no other reason than because they were made in the image and likeness of God. To remind folks that they had we didn't empower folks, we just reminded them of the power that they already had. And encourage them to participate in the marketplace, participate in government, participate in the ways that the things that would help their communities thrive. So I had a chance to see that when it was in Fort Worth. But going back to the earlier question about how CCHD was founded, the bishops, in their wisdom back in the late 60s and early 70s, they recognized that as we watched 110 cities around the country burned because of riots after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, to see those communities go up in smoke and realize that was, in many cases, those riots, that unrest was the voices of people who were struggling and felt like they had no other way of being heard. But the bishops in their wisdom said, we do a great job at our soup kitchens and our homeless shelters, at our schools, at our hospitals, but something is still missing. There are still people who are pushed to the margins of society who can't make decisions based on for themselves, based on what they need to thrive and to live up to the dignity that God wants all of us to live up to. So they formed the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and they said, this is not going to be charity. We're going to be deliberately make sure that this is not a charitable effort, but rather as an empowerment effort. It's an encouraging people to participate. Again, reminding them that they have a role, and it undergirds undergirding all of it is Catholic social teaching. So over the years there was a great momentum. The very unique space that Catholic Campaign for Human Development found itself in was communities that weren't always Catholic. In many cases, most weren't Catholic, but they reached across religious denominations. They reached across ethnicities. We found ourselves in places where nobody else would go, where folks would put down some of the biases and the borders that they have and work together for unity. A typical CCHD group might be, several Catholic churches, a couple of Protestant churches, a mosque, a Jewish synagogue, and maybe even a neighborhood association who are all coming together to work for community safety, for enhancing the education communities, for making sidewalks and streets better in their communities, all having a singular goal, but realizing that if any of them tried to do it individually, they would not be heard. But the fact that they're able to come together to realize that shared humanity and that power gave them something that they could achieve.
It's really a prophetic vision. And one side note I love to think of in this context is that there in the late 60s and early 70s, the bishops weren't the only one who were thinking structurally and how to tackle poverty, but that one of the priests working at the early bishops conference, Monsignor Gino Baroni, also reached out to Catholic sisters about the notion of leveling up, as it were, from direct service to working in politics to affect structural change, and that is the inception of Network. So Network and CCHD have been on parallel paths, and as you've come to join us as a fellow, it's really great to see those threads come together. Listening to you, I just noticed that the vision you paint sounds like it's widely applicable. This notion of groups recognizing the need to come together and accomplish things that they can't do on their own. As you look at just really this really challenging political landscape, in your imagination, just how do you see the lessons that you've picked up along the way and with your journey with the Campaign for Human Development? Like what do we need to do now?
Well, I think one of the good things about the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and certainly it's with Network, and I have to say, sisters, religious women on the whole, I mean, they have an acknowledgement and recognition of being proximate to people, to being proximate to issues, and realizing that they don't have a good understanding as long as they're sitting back in an organization like CCHD in Washington or somewhere and looking down and imposing what their thinking should be. But the reality of getting in, as Pope Francis says, smelling like the sheep, being that field hospital, interacting with folks, and both have a tradition of doing that, and sisters have a long tradition of doing that. Obviously, I spoke about my own history. The Sisters of the Holy Ghost, who came down to Texas, lived in a very poor community, predominantly African American community, where they were very Irish, who were looked upon very, very difficult, and in many cases they had to be somewhat uncomfortable, but they were proximate. They saw, they heard our stories, they knew what we needed. They helped us not just feeding our bodies, but feeding our minds in many, many ways. So I think now the whole idea is that we become more and more polarized, that we don't have the kind of proximity to one another that we can actually, it may sound trite, to actually love one another in a way that God wants us to love one another. As long as the person remains a stranger, as long as the person remains over there or distant, it's easy to criticize, to demonize, to judge. And but until we are able to come together under a common cause and recognize and realize the same things that you want for yourself and your family are the same things I want for myself and my family. And in fact, I have had some difficult struggles. I've been trying to achieve that, but I may have had some difficult struggles along the way that you didn't have. And to have that conversation, that interaction, that kind of unity coming together is something we don't see a whole lot of. But in Network, I think, and the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, to a degree, have been able to tear down some of those barriers. But it seems like now in the environment we find ourselves in, as soon as we tear some down, others are building others back up. They're building them back up in terms of barriers among neighborhoods and in the lack of affordable housing. They build them up in terms of just about racist policies. And like, when did diversity become a bad thing? When did it become a bad idea? something that both the sisters and CCHD has embraced over the years. CCHD embraced the kind of diversity. We realized it was essential. The diversity was essential if we're going to be whole as organizations. So I think, that where we find ourselves now, especially with all of the issues, is there is this I, me mentality, this polarization, this pushing others away, this fear of losing something, be it power, be it resources, or be it, the majority of the population and the demographics of our community. That fear is something that is causing a great deal of our problems now.
Yeah. And as we, witness, the dismantling and the slashing of programs like Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, and just so much bleakness in our politics. I would love to hear. You're clearly someone who's witnessed the potential for transformation, but like what does that look like? You've described so many of the essential, human parts of this, but how can we hold on to hope and work for something as lofty as transformation?
Sure. The temptation may be to despair, especially given some of the events over the last several months, and that, it seems like, with the bill that passed that took, healthcare out of many of our family members, that took food out of the mouths of folks who are struggling, and using that to polarize and fortify the borders, as well as fortify the pockets of very, very rich people. The temptation may be to despair. I think to remind ourselves of the kind of successes we've had in the past, to remind ourselves to promote those, but also to be persistent, to be boldly persistent in the face of all of this. We see that being courteous and with our hat in our hands and being kind in many cases, it's not working with some of the legislators that we're trying to, because they are trying to fortify themselves and hang on to power. So I think we have to boldly say that this is what the gospel values, if you happen to be Christian and Catholic. This is what we believe as persons who have other faith communities. That's one of the beautiful things about CCHD. We had all these faith communities who value the importance of human dignity, who value the importance of housing, who value the importance of healthcare, who value the reality of how economic development is depending on gainful employment. All of these, that's part of the tenets of their faith and of their communities. And to the degree that we can all agree on that and take that to those persons who find themselves, who will in many ways, tout out their faith or their Christianity and say they're doing what they feel is right, and say, no, this is not the Jesus, this is not the faith that I believe, not the reality of where I come from, but boldly confront. And to the degree that we're able to, many of us are able to make connections between the reality and the perceived, to bring people together and say, sit down with this young mother who's going to have difficulty feeding her children, and even though she's working because she's losing her SNAP benefits. She's working full time and still going to lose the SNAP benefits. Sitting next to this immigrant who spent 18 hours in the back of a trailer in the Texas heat just so he can come to a country so he might be able to help himself and his family out that's back home. Doesn't commit crimes, hasn't committed a crime, but he that's the kind of person, that's the kind of value we want in our community, a person who's family oriented, who's concerned, who's hardworking, instead of demonizing, bringing those folks together, having conversations and boldly saying, this is what our gospel calls us to. This is what scripture calls us to, and making them offer the alternative.
So to wrap us up here, do you have any thoughts, observations, anything you'd like to share with folks in terms of this honor you're receiving from Pax Christi USA?
Oh, wow. I mean, I have to say, I'm extremely, extremely honored. I mean, Pax Christi USA, I used their materials and became familiar with them and worked with them when I was in Fort Worth, some 35 years ago, and their work is dedicated, it's consistent. The folks are committed. They are definitely committed to the pursuit of peace and justice. They're bold with it. They're kind of what we need today. So the fact that they're honoring me, and with the namesake of Eileen Egan, I mean the person who personifies the justice movement, if you will, in this country, is something extremely humbling. It's something I'll treasure for the rest of my life.
Well, it's certainly an honor that we here at Network are thrilled about, Ralph, and just so grateful for all of the work you've done through the decades on behalf of Catholic social justice. So thank you.
Thanks, Don. It's great being with you today.